Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center on Duke University's campus, where we are joined by Professor Britt Rusert, who is Associate Professor of African American Studies in the Department of the W.V. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts. She is the author of Fugitive Science, Empiricism and Freedom in Early African American Culture, published by New York University Press, and a 2009 graduate PhD of the English department here at Duke University. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So tell me how you got to this. Like when folks think about race and science in the 19th century, we often think about what's being done to black people. You're telling a very different story about the way that African Americans, former enslaved Africans, are thinking about science and using it as an intervention in discussions about race and freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the project sort of emerged out of, I think about the book as being kind of the flip of my dissertation. So it started as a dissertation here at Duke, and I was sort of thinking about the ways that the plantation emerges as an experimental space, and in some ways it was a project that was thinking about the conditions of possibility for the Tuskegee syphilis study. So how does the kind of what Hortense Spillers thinks about as the transformation of a captive community into a living laboratory. How does that take shape? And then how does that sort of shape a sort of longer history of racialized experiments on peoples of African descent? So the dissertation was very top down in terms of thinking about those histories of exploitation. You know, there's been great work in history and cultural studies over the past several years that have sort of given us very detailed accounts of those histories. And I just sort of started to wonder what the history of black resistance looks like when we think about the history of race and science, because we actually don't know as much about that story as I think we should. So that was really the impetus for the project, to sort of think about, and it's true, at every moment that we have an instantiation of racist science and sort of histories of experiments and racist thought, you have African Americans right there responding, making different kinds of claims. So in part, the book is sort of thinking about that history of response to the rise of racist science in the 19th century. But then, you know, part of my interest in this concept of fugitive science is to also think about forms of refusal and other negotiations and engagements with science that actually aren't engaging with that conversation. So, you know, the big aha moment for me when I was doing, sort of starting my research for the book, was I was doing some, I was sort of browsing through early African American newspapers in the antebellum period, and many of those papers had been digitized but weren't digitized when I was doing my dissertation research. So I was able to do a different kind of searching, which was really sort of helpful. And I found like this like pro-science discourse. So you do see these kinds of responses to Louis Agassiz, to Josiah Nott, to these kind of infamous, notorious racists, right? These sort of the so-called American school of polygenesis. That you see a little bit of that, but more than that, you're seeing like advertisements for microscopes and these like discourses on astronomy and these real kinds of direct engagements with natural science as they're emerging in the antebellum period, but also direct links being made between the kind of practice and practice of science, different ways to mobilize science, and linking them to emancipation struggles. So for me, that's sort of the work that I hope Fugitive Science does. I wanted to do a lot of work in the book, but I want to think about a kind of history of critique and engagement with racist science, and a kind of critique of resistance, but I also want to think about other kinds of engagements with science as well.
This idea of fugitive science, a science that's on the run, right? This great title, and you think about it in three distinct ways. A fugitive science that's oppositional, a fugitive science that's practical, and then a fugitive science that's speculative. Talk about the distinctions between these three modes of science on the run.
Yeah, I mean, so this sort of was my way to conceptualize and try to actually parse out some of these, so that the kind of the different forms of engagements with science that I'm thinking about. So the oppositional fugitive science is more something like Frederick Douglass's Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered, his sort of famous speech from 1854, where he's just taking down the American school of ethnology, like from its very core, right? So it's a kind of direct engagement, and he says this amazing thing in that, and I talk about this in the book, in that speech where he talks about these scientists, he calls them basically charlatans who dare to speak in the name of science. So there you see Douglass kind of doing that direct, in a very Douglassonian way, right? Like direct attack on these guys, taking them down, doing the critique, but also wants to kind of salvage something about science itself, right? And that seems really crucial to me, that there isn't an anti-science discourse here among Black intellectuals and activists. There actually is this attempt to sort of rethink science and to sort of salvage science in a particular way. So that's oppositional fugitive science. And then practical fugitive science is just thinking about, the many different ways that enslaved and nominally free people were engaging with science in their everyday lives, right? And so that could be something like having a compass, or learning something about navigating the stars in terms of escaping north. And so that's how I sort of try to think about a little bit more about vernacular forms of fugitive science with the practical fugitive science. And then the speculative fugitive science is the part of the book that's sort of interested in thinking about a prehistory of Afrofuturism. I mean, I guess that's another sort of narrative of the book, is I wanted to make some arguments about there's this like old school, I don't know if it's old school, there's this old argument in science fiction studies about the relationship between actual science and science fiction. And I just started to realize in this research that if you look back to the antebellum period, the earliest sort of African-American speculative text, so works like Martin Delaney's Blake, is also taking shape through Delaney's own engagements with theories on astronomy. So that's where I get the speculative fugitive science is thinking a little bit more about the Afrofuturist dimensions of this terrain.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that this idea of a fugitive science really opens up a space to rethink Black cultural production in the 19th century.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think about somebody like Martin Delany in his book Blake, and I'm wondering, just from your own training, how having a foundation in literary studies and also this interest in science really provides you with a new framing to think about a figure like Martin Delany from the 19th century. Yeah,
absolutely. So, some of what was helpful for me was like this kind of weird pairing of having a pretty theoretical and conceptual training in graduate school with what I ended up doing after I defended, which was kind of, as many of us actually end up doing, I think, teaching myself how to do primary research in the archives. So, I sort of started to have this feeling, since it was going to be a historically grounded project, I couldn't really just make theoretical claims. And I felt, I tried to make conceptual claims, and that's an important part of the book. But I also, sort of got into the archive, and I really started to become taken by and more interested in the theorizations that were happening by the figures themselves, right? And so like that became a kind of crucial site for me. And so part of it has to do with, I think, my training here in literary studies, but also in African American studies and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here, allowed me to sort of approach these archives in a different way in terms of having a kind of an expansive and hopefully an imaginative relationship to these historical and literary archives. So that was really crucial. But some of it also was just a kind of set of methods from book history, from Black print culture studies, which has been sort of emerging over the past few years, to like think a little bit more about how we define literature itself, right? And I think for folks in Black studies who are working in cultural production and in later periods, I think to think about a kind of broader terrain of the relationship between literature and music and other sites of cultural production, this is where it's all happening. But in the 19th century, I still think, weirdly, even though the sort of disciplines and structures of academic knowledge haven't yet concretized, haven't actually hardened. Weirdly, there's some disciplinary-wise, I think that we tend to sort of think a little bit more about the terrain of literature and science. And so one of the arguments of the book is to say, this is before science gets entrenched within the university, and this is a moment when there's much more cross-fertilization going on between sort of scientific and aesthetic forms. So for me,
much more access to a popular science.
Absolutely, that's right. And so this is all to say, this was a kind of groundbreaking moment when I was reading the serialization of Delaney's Blake in the Anglo-African magazine, and I realized that Delaney himself was published essays on astronomy that were being serialized right next to installments of Blake. And so that was just, I mean, it's it was a kind of it seemed like a minor thing, but it was huge for the project to think, well, maybe we could actually think about Delaney's own, admittedly pretty idiosyncratic theories about astronomy in terms of how we understand that novel.
What were the biggest surprises you found in the archive when you tried to put that theory in conversation with the actual archive?
Yeah, I mean, there were, in terms of just like research discoveries, do you mean? I mean, so there's an ethnology in the first chapter. I talk about basically the varied and robust responses to Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia.
I mean, Banneker offers a response, and we, we never think about Benjamin Banneker as a race man in that way.
That's right, absolutely. Right. So I sort of think about starting with that moment with Banneker and his response to Jefferson, but then also the ways in which Black intellectuals continue to respond to Jefferson while actually holding up Banneker as a kind of race man. So it's about how he kind of gets animated and reanimated as a sort of figure of fugitive science, or a kind of practitioner of fugitive science, by sort of generations of Black intellectuals after him. So that was really crucial, and one of the figures I talk about in that book is Robert Benjamin Lewis, who's this Afro-native autodidact who lived in Maine. He has some connection to abolitionists in Boston, but he's kind of doing his own thing in Maine. And he writes this ethnology called Light and Truth in 1836, and then it's republished in 1844. And I had been doing work on that text for a long time, and I was at the American Antiquarian Society, and I saw a catalog entry for a portrait of Robert Benjamin Lewis. And I thought, I've looked through the catalog here before and I've never seen that before. That must be a mistake. You know, sometimes you see these notes and you think it's going to be something original and amazing, and it's just a photocopy, or so. It's just like a reference. So I didn't. So anyway, the folder comes to me and I open it up, and there's a lithograph. It's a portrait of Robert Benjamin Lewis. That was, I think, that was the most intense and moving parts of the research projects, because it really made me realize, when you're working in this period, when you're working in the archives of enslavement and nominal freedom, we never expect to see an image of one of your subjects. That the kind of terrain of visual culture, I mean, we occasionally have important discoveries, but it was really striking to me that I had been working on the text and his writing for so long, and it never crossed my mind that I might actually find an image of him. So once I found that image, it actually made me realize that questions about visuality and questions about visual representation needed to become more central for the project.
I mean, because you mentioned the ways that some Black thinkers begin to use portraiture as a way to address these popular notions of what race was and who Black people were that was circulating in popular science.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's sort of an engagement. So really, I think, there are these kind of famous and even notorious images that come from types of mankind, from these sort of central texts of racial science in the period. And I end up kind of pushing up against the pretty pretty common reproduction of those famous images. We even see them a lot today. So anytime these texts are talked about, that kind of visual hierarchy, right? From types of mankind is often reproduced. And I end up kind of following the lead of many of the figures in my book who are already in the 1840s and 1850s raising questions about the kind of reproduction of those kinds of images. So I sort of think about the politics of Black portraiture as a response to racist science, but also I'm following the work of Jasmine Nicole Cobb, another Duke professor here, who thinks about strategic refusals to kind of visualize the body. And so that's what I see, especially when I get to the 5th chapter and I'm talking about Sarah Mapps Douglas and sort of Black women's engagements with fugitive science, where they're producing paintings and images and doing kind of visual work, but actually refusing to kind of represent their bodies,
themselves,
or at least,
right.
yeah.
Right.
And so
Right.
so that became important for me as well.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here today with Professor Britt Rusert, Associate Professor of African American Studies at the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts. She is the author of Fugitive Science, Empiricism and Freedom in Early African American Culture, published by New York University Press. We were just talking about, or you were just talking about, where women figure into this. And in that chapter, you talk about how they really create a space for thinking through science in the classroom, and of course in the parlor. And then, at the close of the book, you talk about Ann Petrie's short story, as another way that women are also beginning to engage this kind of narrative. I mean, there's a way in which now, I think, when we think about contemporary Black speculative fiction or science fiction or Afrofuturism, I think the first voices we always tend to think of these days are women.
That's right.
Particularly in terms of
great.
Octavia Butler and Tananarive Due and folks like that. But in the 1940s, when Petrie is writing, or when these women are teaching classes and holding parlor spaces, we don't think about women in science fiction that same kind of,
That's right.
Black women.
That's right, absolutely. And so part of this is also like an archival problem as well. So when I'm thinking about these Black women's intellectual networks in antebellum Philadelphia, a lot of that work is happening, I look at places like the Institute for Colored Youth, and I think about what's happening in Sarah Mapps Douglas's parlor, where she's teaching on hygiene and anatomy. It took me a long time to realize, they're talking about bodies and sex, right? And so this is part of the problem in terms of, I guess in part a certain discourse and narrative around respectability in the antebellum period, but also just to think about where these sites of scientific production were happening. It's in semi-private and private spaces, right? So I think about that a little bit in terms of how Erica Armstrong Dunbar talks about the kind of protected spaces that Black women create for themselves in this period. And so I do try to do some work to kind of imagine and also to speculate on what was happening in these spaces. And it's one of these interesting things where the discourse, when you get an account for what was, what she was teaching and what her training was like, the languages, it has to all has to do with the kind of discourse of anatomy and hygiene. And it was this moment where I realized, the kind of structures and the kind of language about scientific disciplines and knowledge was actually obfuscating in terms of figuring out what was actually going on in those spaces, right? So it was honestly, in that chapter, I try to kind of reframe the history of fugitive science in terms of thinking about it from the primacy of Black women's intellectual and other forms of labor. But I also wanted to think about, I don't want to just like expose what I think they were doing, because I also think they traffic in certain kinds of forms of, I guess what Daphne Brooks would talk about as sort of spectacular opacities. They're kind of doing certain forms of refusal of the public sphere. And so I try to kind of think there a little bit more about,
to honor that.
Yeah, and to think about some of the more subterranean and non-public valences of fugitive science itself.
What's next for you?
Well, I've been trying to think about I guess in terms of this Afrofuturist conversation, I think I'm just creeping up through the decades. So, I'm kind of moving for this project is on, the antebellum period. I'm working on a couple of projects right now on Du Bois and his relationship to speculative fiction and Afrofuturism. So I have a collection coming out with my colleague at UMass Amherst, Whitney Battle Baptiste, coming out from Princeton Architectural Press in the fall. It's a great edited collection. It's a design book about Du Bois's contributions to the Paris Exposition. So it's these amazing data visualizations that Du Bois produced with his students at Atlanta University.
Did you find there was evidence that Du Bois, was actively had knowledge of the kind of work that Delaney was doing around science fiction, and might have even taken that as kind of a model for some of the things he was doing with Dark Princes? And
that's a great question. So the other project I'm working on is with my colleague at Chicago, Adrienne Brown, where we're working on Du Bois's short speculative fiction. And so we're learning a lot about Du Bois's kind of references and his sources of inspiration. And so we're finding that, I think Charles Chestnut is really important. I think weird fiction, genre fiction at the turn of the century. H.G. Wells is really important, you know. But the question, I actually don't know about Du Bois's relationship to someone like Delany. I mean, we know about the importance of a certain kind of German Romanticism, a certain Marxist tradition, Victorian texts, but it's an interesting question about Du Bois's relationship to the antebellum period. Wheatley, he writes on Wheatley. He writes an amazing essay about Phyllis Wheatley as being the kind of prophetic foremother of the kind of Black literary tradition, and it's really in the kind of Dark Princess mode where he kind of figures her as a kind of, in some ways, problematic, but also this kind of amazing and beautiful depiction of her as a kind of princess. So that might, I don't know about Delany, but I think there are some other engagements there.
We've been joined today by Professor Britt Rusert, who is Associate Professor, congratulations, by the way,
very much,
of African American Studies in the department, the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's the author of Fugitive Science, Empiricism and Freedom in Early African American Culture. We are label mates, published by New York University. Thanks for joining us, and welcome back to Duke.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.